The single biggest theme to pay attention to right now in investing is the Federal Reserve, their monetary policy, and its impact on inflation. If we go all the way back to 2020, we know that the Federal Reserve pursued a very loose monetary policy in response to the COVID impact. That loose monetary policy drove an asset bubble across all asset classes. And also, we saw consumer prices explode upwards. That led to the 8.6% inflation that we have today. It's a 40-year high, and it's mainly driven by that loose monetary policy. There was also fiscal policy implemented by elected officials, there were supply chain disruptions, and a number of other things that fed into it. But loose monetary policy was the main driver, in my opinion. Now, going back about 8 months, the Federal Reserve started to talk tough. They started to talk about the fact that they were going to raise interest rates and potentially conduct quantitative tightening. Asset prices have started to fall, but inflation has been persistent. That's why we are at that 40-year high today. Recently, on the All In podcast, Chamath was talking about inflation, CPI being quite sticky, around 8 or 9%, and why the Federal Reserve, not only are they not going to give up in the short term, in his opinion, but it's actually more likely that they're going to overcorrect, that they're going to tighten so much that things will start to break. Other assets that seem to be unaffected today likely will feel the impact of the Federal Reserve's decisions. Here's Chamath's comments on the All In podcast.
I think you need to buckle your seatbelt because the next 3, 4, 5 months of CPI will probably be very, very bad. 7, 8, 9%. Why? There are a handful of components that have gotten completely runaway. Number one, the biggest one is rent. And so rent works on a 3-month lag. We're going to reintroduce what the true owner's equivalent rent is into CPI. So we can already forecast that CPI going up. Oil is at $105 a barrel. Russia is basically trying to break the back of Europe by now messing with their nat gas supplies. The German energy minister yesterday said that if that happens, it could be a contagion equivalent to Lehman Brothers with respect to energy. When you play all of these things out, what you have is unfortunately rampant runaway costs that really have no mechanism to get back in check in the absence of some real governmental changes. Our policy on this Ukraine-Russia war, how we intend to sort of work or cooperate or fight with China, all of these things have to get solved. So in the absence of that, prices are going to continue to go up. And so what does the Fed do? How does it throw away what little credibility it has left when there's 8 and 9% inflation prints and saying, we think we're done for right now? You can't do that. So they will overcorrect because there's just going to be so much pressure for them to act. All roads, I think, lead to lower equity prices. And I think what David said astutely is we've seen the first wave, but now it has to touch all these other areas.
Now, one of the interesting things about the Federal Reserve and their impact on financial markets is that historically, they actually aren't worth paying attention to. What do I mean? If you ask somebody like Peter Lynch, the famous investor who beat the market for decades, he used to always say, if you spent 16 minutes worrying about the macro economy, that's 14 minutes too long. And just focus on buying great companies. Focus on just buying the businesses that will end up generating more cash flow in the future. The problem is, while there is some truth to not paying attention to the macro economy, that the Fed is in control in the moment. We don't have free markets, and the Federal Reserve has created one big trait. Either you go with the Fed or you try to fight them. And as the old adage says, don't fight the Fed. The Federal Reserve conducting this quantitative tightening and increasing interest rates has created a correlation closer and closer to 1 across all assets. Historically, the 60-40 global portfolio of stocks and bonds, if stocks go down, bonds go up, and vice versa. But instead, what we've seen year to date in 2022 is that all assets are falling. Stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities, real estate, Bitcoin, crypto, and everything else. As you see all assets falling together, it signals that we're in somewhat of a liquidity crisis. Maybe shorter, maybe more drawn out. Nobody knows. But at the end of the day, when all assets are correlating towards 1, what you have to ask yourself is, what's the Fed going to do? And until the Fed reverses course, it's very unlikely that asset prices will recover. And the Fed is only going to reverse course if they cause so much pain, so much economic damage that we're sitting in a recession and people are waving the white flag saying, please give up, please give up. Because until then, the Federal Reserve is just looking at that inflation number. And with it sitting at 8.6% in May, it's a big, big problem. And so they're going to do everything they possibly can, go into their toolbox of interest rates and quantitative tightening. and say we got to get inflation under control. This is the big battle. Inflation versus the Federal Reserve. Who will blink first? We're going to find out over the next 6 months or so.